On the night of March 16th, 2026, a deadly airstrike hit Kabul. It was an absolute catastrophe. But what was actually targeted? Well, the answer you get depends entirely on who you ask. So today we're going to break down the conflicting reports and all the available evidence around this devastating event. To really get a sense of the human impact here, just listen to these words from Ahmad. He was a 50-year-old patient and a volunteer guard at a drug rehab center. He was in his dorm with 25 other people when the strike hit. He was the only one who made it out. He talks about watching flames just engulf his friends, hearing them cry out and being completely helpless. His words, they paint an absolutely terrifying picture of what it was like on the ground. And this is the scale of the tragedy we're talking about, at least according to Afghan authorities. They're reporting that more than 400 people were killed and another 250 were injured. Now, if those numbers are confirmed, this would be one of the deadliest single incidents in the recent conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So what happened that night? This is where the whole narrative just splits into two completely different official accounts. Let's take a look at what each government is actually claiming. On one side, you have the Afghan Taliban government. They say a civilian hospital was deliberately targeted in what they're calling a crime against humanity. But on the other side, Pakistan's information minister, Atollah Tarar, insists their Air Force carried out precise, deliberate, and professional strikes against military targets, including ammunition storage. He says, quote, "No hospital and no civilian facility was targeted." So you have two nations, one single event, and two stories that just absolutely cannot both be true. Okay, so to get any closer to the truth here, we have to sift through the evidence and the claims that both sides are making. Let's really dig in and analyze what we know so far. The whole thing really boils down to this one central question. Was the target a civilian hospital filled with vulnerable patients, or was it a legitimate military target that was housing weapons and ammo? Now, what's really fascinating here is how directly the evidence seems to conflict. So Pakistan says there were secondary explosions in their footage, which they claim proves ammo depot was hit. But then CBS News reviewed videos from the ground and reported no visible secondary blasts. Pakistan also claims they hit a military site called Camp Phoenix, which they say is kilometers away from the hospital. But here's the thing. Reporting from the BBC and others confirms the hospital itself is located at the site of the former U.S. military base, Camp Phoenix. And finally, you've got the question of military presence. Pakistan says the facility was right there with ammunition, but Afghan officials swear there were no military facilities nearby, though it is worth noting some reports suggest the Taliban might have been using the camp to build drones. So what exactly is this place at the center of the debate? The Omid Addiction Treatment Hospital, Omid means hope, is a massive 2,000-bed center. It's actually housed in a former NATO camp that was converted to treat thousands of people struggling with drug addiction, which is a massive social crisis in Afghanistan. The key point here is that this wasn't some secret building. It was a known, functioning health facility. So let's move away from the conflicting claims and just look at the undeniable aftermath and how the rest of the world reacted to this absolute tragedy. You know, in the hours and days right after the strike, the scene in Kabul was just grim. Reports described morgues being completely overwhelmed. Families were desperately picking through rubble that was still smoldering, just searching for any news of their loved ones. One ambulance driver said that even after hours and hours of just transporting bodies, he had to go back because there were still victims trapped under all the debris. The global reaction was fast, and it was pretty much unified in condemning what happened. The United Nations immediately came out and reminded everyone that under international law, attacking hospitals is strictly forbidden, and they called for an independent investigation. Human Rights Watch said the same thing. Civilian facilities should never be a target. India called it a barbaric and unconscionable act, while China urged both sides to just de-escalate and show some restraint. It is so critical to understand that this strike did not happen in a vacuum. It was the deadliest moment in a really bitter conflict that had been spiraling out of control for weeks. This timeline really shows you just how quickly things escalated. It kicked off on February 22nd, when Pakistan launched a military operation. Just 4 days later, the Taliban hit back with their own strikes. And then, through early March, the fighting just got more intense, with airstrikes near key places like Kabul, all leading to the March 16th strike. It was a catastrophic peak in a cycle of attack and counterattack. And all of this leaves us with a really difficult question. In the fog of war, when you have two nations telling two completely different stories about the exact same event, how do we ever find the truth? When one side says hospital and the other says ammo depot, the path to getting justice for the more than 400 people who lost their lives becomes incredibly complicated, and it leaves the world struggling with the challenge of trying to find truth in the rubble.